Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome back to the Treasury Update podcast. My name is Brian Weeks, project manager here at Strategic Treasurer, and I'm sitting down today with Craig Jeffery, founder and managing partner of Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here. I'm pretty excited about this series. We haven't done it in a long time.
We haven't, yeah. This Learning from Literature series, it's from a while back. We're picking it back up. The idea is there is wisdom that we can glean in Treasury from historical books, historical quotations. We have a couple of quotations that we're going to get into today. Today's episode is titled, Understanding What You Don't Know. In light of this episode title today, Understanding What You Don't Know, what are the quotes that you have for us?
Well, I have two quotes. One of them is from Socrates, and the other is from his disciple Plato. The first one is, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing, which is a pretty strong statement. And then from Plato, it's, wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. Now, obviously, those weren't quoted in English, but that's the rough translation.
So why these two particular quotes?
In terms of the general title of Understanding What You Don't Know, how do we go about thinking through not understanding certain things, knowing other things? How do we learn and engage over time? And that's relevant to any area of business, certainly any area of finance. Treasury is oftentimes looking ahead, and there's more changes, I would say, in finance as we look ahead. And so the idea of knowing that you don't know everything, right? That you may not know just nothing. You know some things. There's going to be an element of humility and understanding that will help you and help your business as you look forward in Treasury. And then the second one is about thinking through what we say, making sure you're being additive to the conversations. And that requires, being aware, not just spitting words out. I'm thinking through, who am I talking to? What are we trying to accomplish during that? So both of those matter significantly, I think.
So sometimes less is more.
Well, less can be more. And then something that's very calibrated can be significantly more impactful than something that's just kind of general and unnuanced. So yeah, all those things make a lot of sense.
So how does this apply to Treasury?
One aspect, Brian, is that it requires an openness to learning. And when I say that, how many people say I'm not open to learning? But we tend not to think about things that we've already learned once. And when we learn things in a particular domain or an area, and then we go somewhere else and we already know it. And so we're not really thinking, I need to pay attention to nuances or different situations. And I'll give you an example of that. I grew up in Treasury in an insurance company, and insurance companies are very intensive in Treasury in certain areas like payments, investment activity, concerns about, volume, some elements of risk, asset liability matches. Some areas are very intensive. And so when you learn whatever area you grow up in, you sort of translate that into the rest of the world. And so when you move into consulting, or I worked for a bank and you talk to different companies, and it quickly became apparent that what might be reasonable and appropriate for somebody who's doing high volume of payments is significant overkill for someone who's doing a low volume of payments, for example. And so we have to think through, be open to this different scale, different levels of risk, or what's more important in one area to another. That's one aspect, being open and being able to calibrate those differences. That's a hard thing to learn because once you learn something, you're like, hey, I've got that down. I'm moving on to the next area. But you haven't learned to fit it into this whole matrix, if you will. Another area would be that recognizing that there are changes that happen, and what makes sense at one point in time may become ineffective at other points in time. And for those who've been listening to a long time, you probably heard me talk about standards of good corporate conduct, elements about fraud, or what might be a good practice with technology. And as technology changes, you have to make some adjustments to that. So the example of what was reasonably secure, like if you grew up in the 1800s, maybe you just had a latch on your door. Now you need an alarm system, a deadbolt, and a chain, whatever those things are. What was a good standard before is no longer adequate. And so the idea that there are changes occurring, that's necessary. The other is, and I mentioned it a little bit too, about, calibrated understanding and nuances. And so being able to adapt, if you always have a PowerPoint page that says, here's what you should do. This is not just true for consultants who have to talk to many different sizes of companies, many different levels of complexity of companies, but understanding those nuances. Examples, if you're going across the street, sneakers are just fine. If you're going across town, you can use a bike. If you're going across the state, you might use a car, across the country, an airplane, and those types of things. So understanding those nuances makes a difference. And I guess the last thing is, how does it apply to treasury? I think is understanding the difference between some principles that are general guidelines that can be adapted, and then specifics. Specifics might be how a company implements what they need to do for, let's say they're doing foreign exchange trading or they're investing in certain portfolios. There's going to be general principles or frameworks that make sense, that help guide you. And then there's going to be some of the specific elements of what you do.
Okay. Taking a look at that second quote, the one from Plato, wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. With regard to that, what is additive in a conversation?
It's this quote about fools because they have to say something. And just because someone speaks a lot doesn't necessarily make them a fool. But certainly we see that. But the point of this quote is not to say, hey, you're a fool because you're talking too much, or be very, very judicious on what you say if you're wise. But the point is that we all have friends or maybe acquaintances that have to comment on every single topic. And what's your reaction to that? And if you say, well, I don't have any friends who do that, you're that person, And for me, I came to realize that maybe I wasn't an extreme measure, but I did talk way too much. And so I find I have to gate myself a lot. You just can't constantly be providing output. So we know how that reaction is. So being judicious on what you say can make it more valuable for who is hearing that. And so, is this providing guidance? Is it specific domain expertise? All of those matter. And I think the other part about that is knowing who you are, right? If you are a fast processor or a slow processor, some people are like, they're ready to respond instantly. And maybe they've processed everything and they know the outflow. Speed matters more than accuracy. Well, I think it's important to know, just because you process quickly, you may need to spend a little more time letting other people who aren't as fast of a processor, but maybe a deeper, more systematic thinker, make sure you give them time to speak, because they may have thought about things more deeply, maybe not quite as quickly, but they may have thought about things more deeply. And so this idea, if you're a fast processor, of limiting your output means I'm holding back, I'm letting others speak, and that allows for a more cerebral, a more thoughtful conversation to get to where you need to be. And it also doesn't cut people off who they may not be as fast verbally as others, but are extremely bright, know how to handle things. There's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between fast mental processing, speaking, and intelligence, right? There has to be a way of thinking about that if I hold back at times, then we're going to have a better, deeper conversation.
Yeah, there's wisdom to being slow to speak and quick to listen. Yeah. So does this apply to business generally, or would you say there's some aspect that is particularly oriented to treasury?
I think it applies to relationships, and at work there's relationships. I mean, if there's some type of emergency, this is not the time to say, let's wait and gather all the facts. You might be very directive. You can make those decisions quickly, and that's a great way to get things done. Speak quickly. There's usually more time in treasury to react and think through those. So how does this apply to treasury in particular? I think it has to do with the situations when there are different types of risks that emerge. We're used to seeing different types of volatility that occurs. Sometimes it's extremely volatile. Sometimes it's moderate. And the idea that you have recurring risks over time as you gain wisdom from experiencing different types of threats or risk. It's easy to start to understand that every 4 years is a presidential election. People are more cautious in presidential years. Companies are more cautious as they wait to find out who's going to win, and then they can make their decisions. Is it favorable to my industry or not? What's occurring? And then there's other events, COVID, tariffs, tariff wars, financial issues. You go back to 2008, 2009 in different periods of time. So this applies there as well. And so it's gathering information from people who have multiple years of experience, who think about things with lots of connections and the interrelations of those. It also applies to these situations, especially when there's something new has come up. And that could be a new type of threat or issue, or there's a confluence of several things happening at once, a deterioration in the market, a pandemic. What does that have to do? What do we need to look at from a receivable standpoint, from a payable standpoint, from a supply chain perspective? So this idea of thinking about those risks, because Treasury focuses on the forward-looking nature of things. They're spending more time looking ahead than looking back. It's really important to think about what are the other areas that could cause an impact in cash flow, risk, volatility. How should we react if we want to say you want to be the adult in the room? How should we react to that? So I think because there's a larger orientation or a heavier weighting towards the future, which is unknown, many aspects of it are unknown, this is particularly relevant to Treasury.
Good thoughts. So as we wrap up, could you summarize how do these two quotes, how do they teach us?
Well, first I'd say listen. You need to listen to other people. Now, that doesn't mean you listen to everybody. You wouldn't listen to the fool who has no knowledge or awareness of what's going on, but listening to others. If you have a conversation or if you go to a conference and you don't learn anything, where are you listening? Every meeting you should be able to learn at least one thing from every session you go to. And so I think the idea of these quotes don't say about, hey, learn and listen from everybody, but this idea of I need to not just be talking, we need to listen. We're going to learn a lot when we listen. The second point is, of course, ask questions, right? Dive into it so you can understand those nuances and gain perspective. So listen, ask questions. And then the third one is think before you speak. What will you say? Is it helpful? Is it additive? In what way is it helpful? Are you sharing new information, old information, good perspectives, new insights? Is there a different look? Are you associating it with something that people have a shared experience with, something that's happened in the past? And does this trigger a right type of response or mind shift? And so the idea that wise men speak because they have something to say, and fools because they have to say something. Sometimes the conversation that you have might not be thought out all the way to the end, and it still might be good to speak and talk through those items so that there can be some shared discovery as you're thinking through the process. You can't always figure everything out on your own, and then you just speak wonderful wisdom to other people. But you talk through those items. You lay, here are the decision points. Here's what we have to avoid. Here's what seems to be the compelling features. And through that dialogue, you might come to the conclusion that it's like, oh, we're in an industry that, there's tariffs. Our industry is going to be in favor in this new environment because of this reason or that reason, or we're likely to be out of favor if this occurs. So therefore, what do you do? So it helps you calibrate your response. And so, talking through things to lay out the questions, to understand how we frame things or how we put a structure on our understanding of this area. So that's how I would summarize those two quotes.
Well, thank you, Craig, for helping us understand what we don't know as we continue learning from literature.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.